The opinions expressed on this program represent the viewpoints of individual authors or contributors and do not necessarily reflect those of Troy University.
Hello and welcome to EconVersations. I'm your host, Dr. Dan Sutter of the Johnson Center for Political Economy at Troy University. At first glance, charity and markets would seem to have little in common. Business and economic decisions are driven by a desire to acquire money, while charity involves giving this hard-earned money away. But at a deeper level, I think we can see that philanthropy and business have something in common. Namely, that they both involve people coming together voluntarily to try to advance some shared purpose. And both play an important role in helping make the world a better place. Philanthropy has also played an important role historically in America, but today we are witnessing a change in the role of nonprofit organizations in our society. Joining me on EconVersations today to talk about why philanthropy matters and whether it faces a crisis in modern America is Dr. Lenore Ealy, a leading scholar of philanthropy. Dr. Ealy holds a PhD in history from Johns Hopkins and is currently the president of Thinkatecture and the president of the Philanthropic Enterprise, a research institute which studies the role of philanthropy in society. In addition, Dr. Ealy is the editor of the academic journal Conversations on Philanthropy and a former president of the Philadelphia Society. It's a lot to have done. Welcome to the show, Lenore.
Thank you, Dan, for having me.
And you also have roots here in Alabama. I think you have ties to both Alabama and Auburn.
I
right?
do. I attended both schools.
Oh, so you've crossed over that divide. But here today we're at Troy.
We cheer. You have to pick a football team, and we cheer for Auburn. So.
Okay. Well, hopefully that won't offend any of the Tide fans watching.
Hopefully not.
And so let's get into talk about philanthropy. So before we get into the role of philanthropy, one thing that might surprise a lot of people is just sort of the size of our charitable or philanthropic sector here in the United States. It's actually much larger than people might suspect, right?
Very large. Almost 2% of GDP, or actually a little over 2% of GDP every year is of charitable giving.
And so Americans are giving that much money away to charities?
Almost $400 billion a year.
Wow, and I think there's also I think I saw like 64 million Americans actually volunteer for one or another charity.
Right, and the value of that time adds to that monetary giving.
So the sector itself is pretty significant. You saw like 2% of GDP, so it's a sizable sector in and of itself.
Right.
And so it would have some economic importance just as a sector.
Certainly.
But I think what we want to get into today is, as I start our introduction, is suggest that many people might think that charity or philanthropy is a foreign concept to economists, especially since so much of economics is built around self-interest or greed. And if you think of greedy businesses trying to make the most profit they can, the last thing you'd expect is that people would turn around and give that money away. Or if you're studying how you get more money, there can't be a lot of connections to giving it away. But that's not exactly true. There are some deeper some deeper similarities between business and philanthropy, right?
There certainly are. They're both parts of the voluntary organization of human action. So this Austrian economists like to study the field of praxeology, which means the science of human action. And so how do people cooperate together? And both businesses and charitable endeavors are ways that people come together to pursue common goals and shared ideas. The challenge, I think, with economists is that economists haven't often studied charity and philanthropy in the same way that they've studied economic action. So one of the projects that we're working on is inviting economists and other academics to study philanthropy and ask good questions about how it works.
And that's one of the reasons we managed to find each other a few years ago.
Right.
We had this shared interest. You were interested in philanthropy, and I was interested in, I guess, learning some more about the sector. So we've been talking ourselves about this for some time. And I think I just want to mention to everybody that you along with the Johnson Center, hosted a conference on philanthropy here at Troy University a couple of years ago.
We did.
I think that was a very successful event for our Johnson Center. I think it was as successful for your enterprise as well, right?
Yes, a conference called Philanthropy and the Economic Way of Thinking, which seems a little jarring to people, but that's exactly the jarring motif we were going for with trying to get people to think economically about what happens in the charitable sector.
So if you think about it, I guess what might strike people as a little odd is to think of a business as this voluntary organization, just as you know, it might be easy to think of a charity as a voluntary organization because people volunteer
Right.
their time to work for a charity, or they give their money to the charity. But a business is also not based on force or coercion.
Right.
It's voluntary, right?
Right. Both activities have to do with people coming together voluntarily around a certain mission.
So in some circumstances, we might decide to organize an activity as a business and like on a for-profit
Right.
basis. And in other instances, we would decide, well, we're not going to try to make a profit by doing this activity. We care about the
Right.
outcome. Although I guess when the business is producing tires or cars or
Right.
other things that we care about the output there as well too. But we just choose to pursue this organization somewhat differently.
Exactly. And oftentimes with philanthropy, we form charitable organizations when we can't quite figure out the economics of the activity. So when we don't quite know if it's a product that could have a price, or if we're trying to serve a market where we know that the spending power is not up to the ability to purchase those services in the marketplace, we organize those activities in charitable ways.
Now, there's actually I think I remember reading about 1.5 million different charities in the United States.
That's
and
right.
That involves as you get into this sector, I mean, there's a lot of different components to it. You have at least 1.5 million charitable organizations. Right. They range in size tremendously, right?
They range in size just as the economic sector does, from very, very large entities, such as the American Red Cross, which has chapters all over the United States and elsewhere, down to very, very local, small grassroots organizations. So you have mom and pop businesses, you have mom and pop charities the same way.
So you might have like a local animal shelter or animal
Right.
rescue shelter, which is a relatively small organization.
Right.
And then we also see churches that are important in the voluntary sector, and they sort of combine both. You have members of the church who are giving
Right.
money to the church, and then the church is also undertaking charitable activities themselves in many
Yes.
cases, right?
Exactly. And then you also have voluntary associations and clubs and a whole host of different ways of organizing. In fact, our insurance industry grew from the charitable sector. Early job insurance unemployment insurance was provided by voluntary associations.
Well, that's really fascinating. I think it gets into a point that when we see some of the activities of charitable organizations, I think is particularly like maybe when we get to like a church soup kitchen or a shelter for homeless, we see activities that many times the government also undertakes as part of our modern welfare state. So I mean, at one level, the government has programs to try to assist people who are poor, low income, and need money, food, or a place to stay. And we also see churches and other charitable organizations doing some of this same work.
Right. And one of the interesting things about the American political economy of philanthropy, if I may use that term, is that our government has a unique relationship with our nonprofit organizations in the United States. That the government often contracts with nonprofit organizations to provide services, and then you have other charitable organizations that provide those services without government support. So you have apples and oranges sometimes in terms of the flows of funding from government through the charitable sector, through then to the end recipient.
Well, that's an interesting idea. This idea that that was a relatively new thing I learned about this whole possibility that nonprofits are getting a lot of their funding from the government as opposed to contributions. There's one other element of the charitable sector that's probably worth mentioning to our viewers are the role of foundations that
Right.
can, separate from individuals who are making contributions, foundations often will make grants to nonprofit organizations, right?
Right. We have foundations that donate to charities. We have corporations that donate to charity. And we have individuals who donate to charity. And then approximately a third of the income of nonprofit organizations comes from government grants and contracts.
Wow, that's quite a bit. I wouldn't have guessed it's that much. Now, we also, the government also helps support charity in another way that's fairly important. That's through the tax deduction that people get for charitable contributions, right?
Right. If a donor can itemize their deductions and they give enough, they can take a deduction. Prior to the deduction, though, is the tax exemption. So the charities themselves are also exempt from certain kinds of taxes at both local levels and at the federal level.
So like what type would they not have to pay, like sales tax or those types of taxes?
Correct. Many different kinds of taxes. At the local level, many charities don't pay property taxes.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Which in some states with very high property taxes is a very important tax to not to have to pay.
Right.
Especially if you own, a property like a church or other buildings, right?
Right. But that issue itself raises some interesting questions for the sector. For example, if schools are funded through property taxes, but you have a hospital that's built on land that doesn't pay property taxes, you have an interesting way in which charities compete with one another over those tax revenues or the abatement of them. So there's some interesting issues that arise when we think about philanthropy and start probing and asking questions about the way the sector operates.
And I guess another part of the nonprofit sector would be higher education. Most colleges and universities are either private schools that are organized as nonprofits or they're government institutions. So higher in even public universities can claim tax deductions for gifts to the universities, right?
Yep, exactly right.
And so certainly on the economists would say that that's helping to encourage people to give to charity, but given the many great things, beneficial things that charities do, I guess that's the calculation we're making. We're not going to tax these activities because we think that charities are doing good things for society.
The origin of the charitable tax deduction, there's an interesting history, of course, to that story. The tax deduction was unnecessary prior to the creation of a federal income tax in 1913. And with the passage of the income tax bill, there was no charitable deduction in the original legislation that created the income tax. That legislation was created in the War Revenue Act of 1917. And the charitable deduction came about because the tax rates on personal wealth during World War I were on the highest brackets were raised to 80 and 90%, over 90% of income. So the college and university presidents came together and lobbied Congress for a deduction because they had great fear that their donors would no longer be able to support from their surplus income the colleges and universities. And so Congress did at that time enact a charitable deduction to cover the broad range of exempt organizations, religious, charitable, scientific, educational, animal welfare, and protection of children. Those categories of organizations at that time in 1917 were recognized as being qualifying organizations. If you give your money, you would get a deduction.
That's fascinating. I didn't know that the deduction didn't start with the initial income tax.
No, it didn't.
So now we mentioned how in many ways some of the charitable organizations are providing some of the same services that we see in the modern welfare state. Well, we didn't always have a welfare state in the United States. And before we had a welfare state, charitable organizations, voluntary associations played an even bigger role in effect sort of providing for the less fortunate, right?
Correct. I mean, so if there was no federal income tax until 1913, we often act as though it was the creation of the tax that incentivized people to give. But that's not how it worked. And there was a huge tradition of voluntary association, mutual assistance, mutual aid, and philanthropic giving all throughout American history. It's one of the trademarks of American exceptionalism, if you will.
And so some of these modern groups that seem somewhat unfamiliar to people born in the world today, like the is the Lions Club and the Kiwanis and the Moose Lodge. I mean, in the past, those were very important institutions or fraternal organizations, I think they're called, and they provided a lot of safety net type programs.
They did. They provided insurance, unemployment insurance, sick pay. You could join a fund through some of your clubs, and if you were sick, your club would pay for your days out of work. Health insurance types of things, so unemployment insurance.
You know, I think that's really fascinating because, I mean, we do have a welfare state today, and an economist like me would be in favor of trying to roll that back or trim that back, that welfare state. But if we were going to try to do that at all, I mean, the welfare state now serves some very important needs in society. I think it's very important to recognize that there might be an alternative to the government undertaking these welfare state tasks, and philanthropy provides a key there.
Right, it's an attractive idea, but it's a problematic idea to think that our charitable sector today could step in and fulfill that role. To a certain extent, charitable organizations are doing that end user provision of United States welfare programs. But at the same time, there's a large infusion of government money that comes into that sector. So we'd have to think about how those organizations could be more robust if they were going to take up some of that. And that's when we start needing to think about charities and how they operate economically. How do they account for the cost of the things that they provide, and how do they decide how to distribute? So you have production and distribution problems in charities the same way that you do in for-profit businesses. They're just different kinds of problems.
And one of the challenges that charities and nonprofits would face is that if they really want to assist the people they're trying to assist, they need to know how best to go about assisting them, right? They face an important problem here.
Right, and that's one of the reasons why many of us say, well, the welfare state could be smaller and we could do this work better through local organizations because of the distance of a federal bureaucracy to the end recipient of charity. There is a knowledge problem in terms of what that person needs that can be better served by local people.
You know, economists will use the term knowledge problem and apply it to government programs a lot of times to suggest that the government bureaucrats have a hard time learning what types of regulations or what types of assistance might be necessary. But that's a problem that also applies to charities then, right?
It is, definitely.
And so then you hinted at this, but I guess at some level, because maybe the charities, in many cases, the charities are a little closer to the people they're trying to assist as opposed to more distant bureaucracies. What we really sort of think is that although both charities and governments face a knowledge problem, we think that maybe charities might be better able to solve this problem. It doesn't go away.
Right.
It's still an important problem.
Right. But
charities might have a little bit better ability to learn and use the knowledge about what it is going to assist people.
And I think that is part of the question, is how did the organizations learn? And if things are being provided in a uniform manner, which is what a bureaucratic state has to do, they have to provide things in a uniform manner with uniform rules, it becomes very difficult to respond nimbly on the ground to the needs of local communities, of single individuals who have challenges. And we know that the unfortunate people in our country, or the uneducated, people trapped in poverty, each one of those situations is a unique situation and might require a different treatment. And so having local charities that can work with these people to help provide assistance and resources and jobs and all of these things becomes a lot more effective. And in that way, the learning takes place on the ground much more quickly and much more rapidly in a way that can be meaningfully applied to a single life.
And actually there's a sort of like almost a second level of knowledge problem, if you want to say, with charities, because when people make gifts to charities, they often feel like we recognize that giving to charity is an important thing, and as a donor, once you give to charity, you might think like, okay, well, I've done my duty, I've contributed to the good cause, but there's no guarantee that that the charity is necessarily going to do good things with the money once you give it to them. But if people really sort of are giving money to charities because they want to experience what's sometimes referred to as a warm glow, that this creates an important difficulty with feedback to donors, right?
Well, it does, and so we have a lot of scope for different kinds of giving. So we all know the story of the Good Samaritan, which is one man who sees another man injured on the side of the road and is able to help. And yet he takes that man, he doesn't take him to his home and serve him individually, he takes him to a lodging, to a public place, and puts him there and gets him help in that way. So we have both individual cases of charity, and then we have institutional ways that we organize charity and charitable services. And so our charitable sector, all these organizations, are organizations that are specializing in a particular area. And so that enables them to learn how best to treat alcohol addiction, or to treat job training, and to develop those things. So you get organizations that can learn as well.
And certainly if you have 1.5 million charitable organizations, there's at least some competition between these charities for donations.
Certainly.
And if some are performing better, they might be able to attract more donations.
Right. Well, and we talk too about, in economics, we talk about the division of labor. And in many ways, this organizational development in the charitable sector tracks that question. I mean, if you have someone who's working on teenage homelessness, they become an expert in how to help with teenage homelessness in their own community. And so you get a level of expertise that works, so that if a donor now looks around and says, I think I'd like to help with the teenage homeless problem in our city, then it makes sense for that donor to tap the knowledge of the people who are working in the field and learning about that problem. So you do have a specialization.
Yeah, and that's a fascinating element of this. Now, another thing that you read about with charities is that many charities end up spending a lot of the money they raise on fundraising or their own expenses. I mean, you hear some horror stories sometimes, and that represents another level of potential problems with in the charitable sector, right?
Oh, it's tremendously challenging. So if you want to invest in a stock, you have many kinds of resources to help you, including opening your paper and seeing where the stock prices are, and online analytics and all kinds of things. But if you want to invest in charities, there are many fewer tools that help us understand, and part of that's because we don't have prices in the charitable sector. So we're working in an environment where the donor says, I'd like to buy some shares of help with teenage homelessness, but I don't know the price of those shares. So it becomes very challenging. It requires a lot more discernment on the part of the donor. And in a positive way, it actually engages the donor in an integral activity, in a learning about their community. So the charitable sector helps us, if we're smart as donors, in learning and thickening the communities in which we live.
And we've seen some organizations that have sort of arisen as intermediaries that sort of like check or monitor or serve as a watchdog on charitable organizations, especially to alert donors to the organizations that are spending most of their money on fundraising or administration, and not actually getting any money out there to the causes they claim to be serving, right?
Absolutely. And some of those platforms are very useful, and it always pays a donor to go and do that research. One of the challenges of the rating systems, though, is that, again, we don't really know what measures effectiveness across all of the different kinds of activities. And so some of the measurement organizations will say, well, the charity shouldn't have more than 10% overhead. 10% spent on administrative expenses. But that's a rule that may not apply in some types of organizations which require a greater expenditure. So a lot more work needs to be done so that we can understand how different sectors within the charitable economy operate with different kinds of economic needs.
Could the government maybe play a role here in helping to hold charities accountable for their activities? I mean, ultimately, if charities are getting all these tax deductions or tax breaks, is because they should be doing something good. Could the government help donors by holding charities accountable using some type of accounting standards?
A lot of larger charities already subscribe to the accounting standards that exist. One of the challenges, though, with using government to create that accountability or to enforce that accountability would be we've got 1.5 million charities. You'd need another large federal bureaucracy to do that work. So this is part of the due diligence really needs to happen out at the level of individual donors. And one of the problems we see in charities, we speak a lot about these days about crony capitalism, but there's also a species of philanthropy that can be called crony philanthropy with charities that exist because they've managed to go and get government grants, and they're not economically efficient organizations either. So there are a lot of problems that cut across both ways. So no, I wouldn't be in favor of a federal type of mechanism to enforce accountability.
It would be really up to the individual donors to hold the charities they're giving to accountable in whatever fashion they want to hold them accountable.
Right, and there should be multiple tools. I mean, again, let's compare an investor in the economic sector. Investors use a lot of different tools, and they find the people whose advice they trust, and they rely upon those people because they like the way they run the numbers, or they like the analytic methodology, or they just have a good feeling in their gut. We act sometimes as though what happens in the economic sector is very regularized and disciplined, and we know many times that investment in economics runs on emotions and gut feelings sometimes. But I think that suggests then that donors can equally scrutinize their own philanthropy if they bring some thinking to the process.
Now, is one other thing I wanted to touch on here is we mentioned the fact that about 1/3 of the revenue of charities is coming from the government, and they're doing, in fact, some services that the government could otherwise be doing. Now, in my own research on natural disasters, I've seen the groups like Samaritan's Purse and the American Red Cross, some charitable organizations that do great things and really effectively help people after disasters. And surveys and other evidence show that they seem to be a lot more effective than government organizations like FEMA. Now, from my perspective, then I say like, oh well, if we're going to take some money that FEMA might be distributing and instead send it to charitable organizations, if they're delivering the services more effectively, that sounds to me like it might be a good idea, but there's actually some problems maybe with that, right?
Well, one of the challenges, I think, is the perception of FEMA existing. Because it exists, people expect that it's going to come in and solve problems. And in fact, FEMA has a very limited mandate, and it is an emergency management agency. It exists to help coordinate that response. So when people say, oh, FEMA should come in and solve the problems and do the distribution, that's really not FEMA's job. And so we saw after Hurricane Katrina, there was a lot of political and journalistic controversy over FEMA's trucks with ice melting on the highways and bad expenditures of money. So yes, I mean, it's tempting to think that that would solve the problem just to take those dollars and distribute them. But one of the other challenges is the way that the federal government allocates funds after a disaster. So after Hurricane Katrina, let's stay with that example for a moment. I think the FEMA problems early on during the relief phase were very minor compared to the larger problems and the delays with the recovery phase with the delivery of congressionally mandated funds to the states, who then had to go through a political process to create a program. So we have really horrific stories about the Road Home program in Louisiana and how long it took and how many bureaucratic steps it took for people to get assistance. And so there are problems cutting across at all kinds of levels. But there's a huge coordination problem, really, after a disaster. And so all of these groups, the on-the-ground spontaneous volunteers, to the Red Cross, to the government agencies, everybody's down there trying to work the problems. And one of the challenges is to be on the ground and see, well, which groups are more effective. So we need some comparative analysis, which I know you've done some in your own scholarly research, trying to look at some of these things.
Well, this has been really fascinating. I think we've covered a lot of ground, but I know just from learning about the sector, there's a lot more issues we could have gotten into today. But sadly, we've come to the end of our time. I want to thank you for joining me today on EconVersations, and thank you. Join us again next time for another EconVersations.
Opinions expressed on this program represent the viewpoints of individual authors or contributors and do not necessarily reflect those of Troy University.